This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome to IAQ Radio Plus. This week is episode 630, and we've got three PhD we got a bunch of doctors on the show. We're going to talk today about the perspectives on COVID-19 and how it will change the IAQ world. We've got Dr. Bill Bahnfleth, we've got Dr. Stephanie Taylor, Dr. Kishore Khankari. Looking forward to a great show. Before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. They are the reason we can continue doing IAQ Radio. Please thank them for their support of the show. Our marquee sponsor is Instascope at instascope.co. Our association sponsors are the American Industrial Hygiene Association at AIHA.org, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists at ACGIH.org, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute at CIRIScience.org, the Indoor Air Quality Association at IAQA.org, the Restoration Industry Association at restorationindustry.org, the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification at IICRC.org, and Healthy Buildings America 2021 at HB2021-America.org. Industry sponsors are AEML Laboratories at AEMLINC.com, Particles Plus at particlesplus.com, Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions at graywolfsensing.com, TSI Inc. at TSI.com, Sunbelt Rentals at sunbeltrentals.com, April Air at aprilaire.com, and Healthy Indoors Magazine at healthyindoors.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick at cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations go out to IAQ Dottie in Central City, PA, who identified Buddy Ebsen as the cast member of the original Wizard of Oz, who was replaced after becoming severely sickened by his makeup. The IAQ Radio Trivia question for today, June 18, 2021, has been sponsored by TSI Inc., an industry leader in precision instrumentation for the monitoring of indoor air. Learn how to expand your IAQ investigations at tsi.com. Here is today's trivia question. What percentage of people confirmed to have COVID-19 develop mild or moderate symptoms? Back to you, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. So we've got Dr. Bill Bahnfleth. He's a professor of architectural engineering at Penn State. His PhD is in mechanical engineering from the University of Illinois. He's the author or co-author of more than 170 technical papers and articles and 14 books and book chapters. He is also a fellow at ASHRAE, and he's a past president of ASHRAE. Dr. Kishore Khankari is the president and the founder of ANSIGHT LLC, a specialist in computational fluid dynamics. Dr. Khankari is a noted expert in the field. He has a PhD in CFD from the University of Minnesota and has regularly published in technical journals. He's also an ASHRAE fellow and an ASHRAE distinguished lecturer. And we've got Dr. Stephanie Taylor. After working for decades as a physician, she decided to obtain her master's degree in architecture and infection control certification. Dr. Taylor is the CEO of Taylor Healthcare Commissioning, Inc., where her lifelong commitment to patient care focuses on improving the physical healthcare environment and clinical work practices to protect and help her patients. Welcome all to the show. Great to have you here. Let's start with Dr. Khankari. You're new to our audience, so I wanted to get you up here first. We were all kind of emailing back and forth about this show, and Bill actually came up with the idea of focusing not just on COVID-19, but how it's changed indoor air quality in general. And I think we'll start with you, Dr. Khankari. What do you think is the most important lesson we learned from this pandemic?
Joe, first of all, thank you for inviting me on your show. This is my first time. I'm very impressed by your passion about indoor air quality. And you are doing this from 2007, 600 plus shows, commendable. Thank you so much for doing this for our society.
Thank you.
And creating the awareness for indoor air quality. Well, what I learned during COVID pandemic, well, I learned how to live in a cave. It prepared me. If I have to go to Himalayas for meditation, I think I'm ready now because I know how not to have social contacts and live alone. But leaving that aside from indoor air quality, what I learned is how ignorant the society is in general about indoor air quality, and how little we in scientific community know or need to do for improving the indoor air quality. This was an eye-opener for everyone. I used to hear on TV and on radio, right from Dr. Fauci to a local anchor, everyone is talking about good ventilation, and that became a buzzword in pandemic. And I looked around and I found we don't have really a comprehensive definition of good ventilation that will cover all aspects of indoor air quality. So I think to summarize my thought is that we have to do a lot about indoor air quality. What we have done is really good, achievable, but it's not enough now. And pandemic has opened our eyes.
That's an interesting. I like that. It's we know a good bit, but not as much as maybe we thought we did. And it gets back to that definition. What is good ventilation? Let's get Dr. Bahnfleth. Let's get your thoughts on what happened. What's the most important lesson of the pandemic? Ventilation always makes me think of you and ASHRAE.
Yes, air, and particularly hot air, is something people often think of when they think of me. I'm really glad to be back, and I think the main lesson we've learned is IAQ is as important as people have been saying it is, and we weren't prepared. We didn't have a playbook for what do you do when there's an epidemic or a pandemic that we could open up and know what to do. And we've spent a year essentially trying to figure out what to do about buildings to make them safe, how people should behave, all of that. And I think that the lesson for the future is that we really do need to think about what to do next time and to have plans in place and to design our buildings in the future so that they can respond to an event like this, or even an event like a wildfire. We've got a drought going on in the West again, so looking for wildfires later. I think we didn't have resilient infrastructure, and we didn't have plans for how to make ourselves safe when the inevitable crisis came along. And we're just way too good at forgetting that eventually something like this is going to happen.
You bring up a great point there, and I thought we were headed that way after 9/11, and we started talking about indoor air quality, but then it kind of died away with all the other things that were going on, and I don't know if this time it will be that we'll actually follow through, but it's an interesting point.
I remember from back then that one of the EPA people I was working with on research said, if there are any more terrorist incidents in a couple of years, this is all going to go away. And he was right.
Good point. Very good point. Dr. Taylor, you have a unique perspective on this as an MD who, for decades treated people, and now you focused more on indoor air quality, I think, than on just daily treating people. What are your thoughts on what the most important lessons from this pandemic were?
That's a great question. Thank you, Joe. And what you just said was that I spend more time now thinking about indoor air quality than I do on actually treating people day to day. But I would rephrase that, because managing indoor air quality for our health is actually treating all of us, not just day to day, but minute to minute. And I think one of the most important lessons from this pandemic is to raise awareness about how incredibly impactful our environment, which happens to be indoors most of the time, is to our health. And so I think the most important thing is making these incredibly important components visible, because as human beings, if we don't sense it with our five senses, we don't generally address it. We forget about it. We might be frightened for the moment, but then we tend to put things on the shelf. So I think the most important lesson that I've learned is the essential need to create visibility around the indoor metrics that are impactful to our health, and then to analyze them and understand them simply and clearly from the perspective of human health.
Interesting.
That's what I think I've learned.
Well, you're also doing that. We were talking before the show about your new venture, and this wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. Now, with the advent of better particle counters and low-cost sensors and the availability of these things, you can make the indoor air visible for people.
Exactly. And Joe, just like we were talking about, and thankfully, I thank TSI, because TSI just launched on Monday the AirAssure sensor that we're using that measures the metrics that we know are impactful for human health. Then we draw that data into our algorithm, analyze it, and reveal the health impact. But you're absolutely right. Prior to the ability to create these low cost and effective, accurate sensors, we couldn't create this visibility in the same way.
I think it's going to change things dramatically. Let me get the second question here. Is it possible we will go back to the pre-COVID status quo after the pain of this, current pandemic subsides? Let's start with Dr. Khankari.
Well, it depends on how you define the pain of pandemic. It's the if you mean that the infectious aerosols will be vanished one day and we will have very low rate of infection, well, we can resume our normal life, and the fear of this getting infected will go away eventually as we will start mingling with the outside people. Well, even if we go back to the status quo and where we were, the underlying problem of indoor air quality is not really solved. As I said before, this is an eye-opener for all of us, for the people who are our consumers of indoor air quality, people who design these systems, and the researchers like Bill, who are developing new technology and understanding the fundamentals of indoor air quality. I think unless we address that now and properly, I don't think we are ready for the next pandemic or for a better indoor air quality.
Bill, can you follow up on that?
Sure. I don't think we should ever underestimate the ability of people to feel the crisis is over and go back to normal. So I've already seen it, that we've got fairly high rates of vaccination now in the US, and infections and deaths are dropping. And already people are wondering, well, can I pull my MERV 13 filters out of the air handling unit and put the 8s back in? And do I really need to increase ventilation? So there's that factor, but I think that there are some real forces at play that work against changing things. One is just the somewhat non-quantitative nature of our knowledge about IAQ. I mean, we know what things are important, but really quantifying the cause and effect in a way that we can monetize is difficult. But we know that some air quality interventions, more ventilation, for example, increase energy use. And there are a lot of people who are bringing back to the fore the issue of energy use and sustainability, and we can't do that. And then the cost of modifications to buildings. I think there are going to be a lot of pressures that are going to try to make standards and practices stay where they are. And then the only hope I have is that we've seen enough in the last year and thought enough about it that this time we'll push better air quality over the top by combining resilience and epidemic mitigation with better indoor air quality generally, which is something we can probably talk about more later on in the discussion. But I think you put those two things together and there's a powerful case for doing something, but not one that is guaranteed of success.
Interesting. All right, Dr. Taylor, same question for you. You think we'll go back to that pre-COVID status?
So I'm not sure, actually. I hope not. If I look at human behavior after the Spanish influenza in 1918, that was a crisis. Many people died and we went back to normal, quote unquote, normal. However, I think things are different in 2021 in several ways. One, there's much more effective and rapid media. So we tend to know what's going on around the world in an instant. So hopefully that information transference will help us not forget about what's happening not only here, but around the world. But secondly, I don't think we will forget about it, because if you look at the trajectory of human illness, if you look at inflammatory diseases, infectious diseases, autoimmune disorders, many of these things are on the rise. And there's an abundance of data that ties the increase in those diseases to indoor air quality. And so I think people with their eyes open and who are interested in seeing this will understand that one of the most effective drivers for human health or disease is actually the indoor environment. And if we do forget about it, I think, unfortunately, we will be reminded, probably sooner rather than later, by another event such as COVID-19.
That is a great point. I want to go off script just a little bit, go back to Dr. Bahnfleth real quick. Last week, we did a show and we were talking with Ed Light, who's a real well-known certified industrial hygienist. He does a lot of school work in the DC area. And we're talking about increasing ventilation, better filtration, so on and so forth. His feeling was that school districts and others who are trying to figure out what to do about this pandemic are realizing they really need to get back and just take care of the basic things, like making sure their controls work, that their relative humidity sensors are actually calibrated, and that we should be focused more on spending the money on just basic operations and maintenance, as opposed to trying to increase ventilation or add filtration, etc. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, Ed's got his own perspective, as do several others, and this goes back to my comment about, did we really have a plan? There's so many different voices about what's the right thing to do, but I can't disagree with the aspect of his message, which is start with fundamentals. When we look at the GAO report on schools and see that a third of the HVAC systems need to be repaired or replaced, or stated another way, 41% of school districts have 50% or more of their HVAC systems that need repair or replacement. That's a pretty strong message. So if your base building doesn't work properly, what's the point of trying to add things onto it to provide better protection? I agree with that point strongly. And I don't think, another thing I would agree with is that we don't need new silver bullets to make indoor air quality better. This is something I harp on all the time when I have an opportunity, which is we have tools available now that we know are effective. We know how to apply them. We're just not doing it properly or to the extent necessary.
Yeah, I thought the show came up at the last minute last week. We had a guest that couldn't make it, and I thought it was a really good show, and that Ed brought up a very important point there. So I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
Mm-hmm.
Let me go to
Joe.
Go ahead,
if I may, when you were putting together the questions, I misread one of the questions, and I misread the word in subsides. I misread it as subsidies. And what I'd like everybody to comment is, what do you think is going to happen when the money goes away? When the government starts giving people out of work money, schools money, buildings money, and so on and so forth. Do you think that the spending is going to, be done by the people themselves, or do you think they're going to expect the government to pay all the bills to fix everything? So if we could just go around the horn. I'd
Dr.
appreciate your
Khankari,
comments.
let's start with you.
Yeah, again, I have a different view about indoor air quality, slightly different. See, more emphasis is placed on increasing the ventilation rates, improving the filtration, and maybe adding some supplementary cleaning devices. They're all good. They're all essential, but they're not enough. See, air is the primary carrier of heat, moisture, contaminants, infectious aerosol. You can bring all the clean air, all uncontaminated air through your diffusers, but the sources of contaminants are present right where we breathe. That is 4 to 6 feet height from the floor. And so unless we wrap this around and say, well, how air moves within the indoor spaces, where the sources of contaminants are, where the obstructions to airflow are, and unless we put a microscope on the spaces and understand how air moves and where the contaminants are going, just improving the ventilation rates or increasing the more airflow rate to the spaces is not enough. And so when the government help goes away, when people don't have money, and really you need money when you need to do the infrastructure retrofit or something like that. But there are few simple things. If you can add one more written location into the classroom, or just change where the diffusers are, it can help to improve the indoor air quality. So I come from a different expertise and different viewpoint on this.
That's an interesting point. And you do that through the computational fluid dynamics, and you expect that will be more in demand as we go further away from this COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, indeed. Because computational fluid dynamics is not a recent science. It has been there for a long time. Aerospace industry, automotive industry, even those who are creating the world's best vacuum cleaners are using computational fluid dynamics for their benefit, for the advantage of improving their products and services. So why our industry should shy for using that? I'm not expecting every school to use CFD. I'm not expecting every design engineer should be trained and use on every project. But this valuable tool that really puts the microscope on the space, and we can visualize airflow patterns. We can see where the contaminated spaces are and spots in the indoor spaces. Use that to develop better guidelines for the people.
Interesting. Let's go to Dr. Taylor. What's your thoughts on Cliff's question? Will we go, once the money's gone, what happens?
So that's an interesting question, and I, not one that is exactly my area of expertise, economics. However, as I see it, money gives people, whether that person is an individual homeowner or commercial real estate developer, the ability to do something with someone else's money. So that's the ability to do something. But I think that's the disconnect that I see that prevents buildings from being managed more properly is a disconnect between who owns a building, who manages a building, and the occupants. So I think that uniting the sort of train of responsibility so that the person who experiences the health impact is the one who makes decisions will certainly help move things forward in a good way. I also believe that, and it's interesting, Kishore, when you were talking about computerized flow dynamic analysis, I see a lot of connection between what I'm focusing on now, which is creating visibility around the health impact of an indoor space, and what you're doing, which is visualizing the flow of air. I think that visualization is very valuable. But I feel that by creating clarity for the person who's being affected by the indoor air quality, creating clarity for that person will help move things forward, because none of us want to be sick. None of us want our children to be sick. None of us want to get sicker when we're in the hospital because of air quality. And in my experience, by starting with occupant health and using that as a lens to proper indoor air management, first, in my experience, I learned how important relative humidity, 40 to 60%, is for our health. So I think that uniting the chain of responsibility and creating visibility, and in my work, it's through using the AirAssure sensors, is absolutely key to keeping this moving in the right direction.
All right, Dr. Bahnfleth, comments on Cliff's question?
Sure. Well, I mean, we have a problem, of course, with split incentive, who pays and who benefits that apply to a lot of buildings. And so, yes, when the money dries up, if that's all it is, if a pot of money is dumped out there to support improvements, then when it's gone, not much will happen. So I think what that clearly indicates, and maybe it's not the kind of thing you like to say in the U.S., but policy and regulation is going to be important in the future. There's a huge externality in terms of national healthcare costs that results from people being in buildings that have mediocre or poor IAQ. And when we did the ASHRAE 2016 IAQ conference that was focused on policy and standards, one of our keynote speakers said that if we just had better air quality in buildings, it would go a long way to solving our national healthcare cost crisis. Because, for example, we take kids who have asthma attacks and they go to the hospital, the emergency room, we treat them, and then we send them back to the environment that put them in the hospital in the first place. So I do think that policy and standards are going to play a big role in the future if we're really going to be successful at moving forward from where we are.
You mentioned policy and standards, and that's kind of the next question. What is the most important change that needs to be made to IAQ standards? And let's start with Dr. Taylor on that one.
I think that the most important standard that we should implement is a minimum relative humidity in our occupied buildings.
Minimum RH. And that I got to follow up on that, because that leads right into a question that was sent by Ed, actually. ASHRAE's 40% minimum relative humidity recommendation. What is the status of that? He says, I can't find any COVID epidemiology supporting this. Am I missing anything? Anybody want to comment on that?
Well,
Aside from ASHRAE not having a 40% relative humidity recommendation, if you look at the core recommendations, it says maintain temperature and humidity set points. The 30 to 60 is in the chapter on humidifiers.
Okay.
So Canada implemented I think Canada's the first country to implement a best practices of 40 to 60 in residential homes and in long-term senior long-term care facilities. And if you look into what happens in buildings around the world, different climates with 40% indoor relative humidity, depending on the building envelope and insulation, you can run into problems. And I thought Bill would say that. And I understand that, but addressing the need to look at the minimum relative humidity, I think is absolutely essential if we're going to ever be healthy indoors.
I commented on the sort of the lack of knowledge in some areas about IAQ, and one of the problems is that where infectious diseases are concerned, we often are really thin on what you would call epidemiological data and actually cause and effect between exposure and illness. And of course, you could say that that's why it took WHO over a year to agree that airborne transmission occurs, is because nobody could show them an RCT that proved it. And yet there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that occurs. So I would say we know that COVID-19 is a virus that responds to temperature and humidity, and we can take that into account in assessing what exposure is. But I think Ed's probably right that we don't have epidemiologic data that proves that it affects the incidence of illness, just like we don't have data for almost anything else you could name. Ventilation, starting for one.
Good point.
Except don't forget that part of disease transmission is the ability of the human being to resist getting sick. And so not only does indoor air quality affect the exposure to external things such as viruses, but it also impacts our immune system.
So the question is, has anybody done that for COVID-19?
Yeah, there are numerous epidemiological studies looking at outdoor weather patterns and indoor conditions that relate to higher incidence of new cases and deaths. So I say yes, those studies have been done. As a matter of fact, I did one of them with MIT.
All right, let's go. I want to finish. Go ahead, Dr. Khankari, please.
Sorry, about the standards, again, not getting into the details of which value, which number is good or bad. In my observation, we need to completely change our thinking about standards. These standards are prescriptive standards. They are not performance-based. And what is happening is the design community is using these standards as design guidelines. If you look any ASHRAE standard, the first thing written on the top of that standard, this is the minimum requirement. Standard is not the optimum recommendations for designers to follow just in the letters and forget the spirit behind it. And so unless we educate our design community that not to be slave of standards and codes, but to understand what is good for the people, our buildings are for the people. And so unless we have the performance-based standards and people, owners and facility managers and designers are held responsible for performance, I don't think these standards will do any good to the society.
Very interesting point. Dr. Bahnfleth, let's let you chime in on the standards before we go to halftime.
Sure. Well, I think that our standards for air quality, like the 62s of ASHRAE, need to focus explicitly on infection risk. It's one thing that we've learned, and I would say also we need better integration with standards. One of the problems that we have is siloing. We've got energy standards that really would like us to use as little outdoor air as possible to save energy, and we have a thermal comfort standard that says it's okay to have zero relative humidity because it doesn't affect thermal comfort, and we have an air quality standard that's mainly concerned about mold growth. So unless we can somehow figure out how to integrate those, we're not going to get good solutions. You open standard 62.1 and it gives you a factor you can use to account for how bad your air distribution is, but there really isn't a design standard that drives you in the direction of using good air distribution along with an appropriate amount of ventilation and air cleaners. So I do think there's a lot of work to do there, as Kishore was suggesting.
Interesting. And Ed commented that he was referring to the 2020 ASHRAE recommendations for 40% relative humidity. It looks like the revised 2021 guidance no longer recommends 40%. Anybody have a thought on that?
Well, that's what I was talking about. We published our core recommendations in January of this year to clarify what the current positions were. And they did change between the time that the infectious aerosols PD was published in April of 2020 and January. And I want to make it clear, we're not saying that the ASHRAE task force doesn't think 40% relative humidity is a good idea. It's simply that as something that might be taken as a requirement for all of the buildings that would be hard to humidify, and for which there are other measures that could be taken in the short term for infection prevention, it didn't seem to prioritize as highly as some people believe it does. But there are, those differences of opinion are fine, and we continue to discuss them.
So can I speak up here? Joe,
do.
I think maybe I'm double dipping here, but when I completely agree with what Kishore said about standards and what Bill said about siloing, but one of the professions that's missing in managing indoor air quality for human health are clinicians.
Yeah.
Oh, and I think that's a huge, for me as a physician, that's a huge embarrassment to ask, where are the physicians in this discussion? There are not enough of us. Because when you bring in human health, then for example, with humidity, becomes really clear that low relative humidity is terrible for our health. So we need more clinicians in this discussion.
You raised an interesting point. I'll just comment briefly on, Stephanie, which is how hard it's been to find physicians to be on the ASHRAE Environmental Health Committee. We're lucky to have you. Before that, Jan Sundell was basically the usual suspect, and it's been relatively hard. So you need to talk to your profession about engaging with organizations like ASHRAE and taking buildings as a factor in health more seriously than some of them have.
Oh my gosh, Bill. First of all, I'm really gratified to hear that you think you're lucky to have me involved, because you and I sometimes butt heads. But no, you're right. I mean, I don't know what it is about physicians, but it's very hard for us to enter into an area that's not our expertise and be comfortable doing that. I think it's true for everyone, but it's especially true for physicians.
We've got to
I'll
stop.
work on it.
That would be great. I wanted to mention occupants too. Maybe they need to be more involved. But I think they're easier to get involved maybe than the medical community is. Let's stop and thank our sponsors. We'll be back for the second half. We've got Dr. Bill Bahnfleth, Dr. Stephanie Taylor, Dr. Kishore Khankari. We're talking about how COVID might change the IAQ world. Our marquee sponsor, Instascope. More jobs done faster with the future of IAQ assessment technology. Unlimited samples, instant results, and cloud-based data at instascope.co. Our association sponsors are AIHA, Healthy Workplaces, A Healthier World, at aiha.org. ACGIH, Advancing Careers of Professionals in Environmental Health, Industrial Hygiene, and Safety, interested in defining their science, at acgih.org. The Cleaning Industry Research Institute, see more deeply through science and research, at ciriscience.org. The Indoor Air Quality Association, promoting the exchange of indoor environmental quality information through education and research, at IAQA.org. The Restoration Industry Association, the granddaddy of the restoration industry, network with leaders, at restorationindustry.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry, at iicrc.org. And Healthy Buildings America 2021 in Honolulu, Hawaii, November 9 through 11, at hb2021-america.org. IAQ Radio industry sponsors are AEML Laboratories, free shipping, great pricing, same-day results with no rush fee at aemlinc.com. Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us at particlesplus.com. Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, over 20 years manufacturing accurate, reliable IAQ instrumentation for portable, short-term, and continuous monitoring, at graywolfsensing.com. TSI Inc., an industry leader in precision instrumentation for monitoring indoor air. Learn how to expand your IAQ investigations at tsi.com. Sunbelt Rentals, availability, reliability, and ease for all your IAQ and restoration needs at sunbeltrentals.com. April Air, healthy home, at aprilaire.com. healthyindoors.com. And Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online magazine for industry professionals and consumers at healthyindoors.com. All right, we're back. I want to jump right into this next question. Start with Dr. Bahnfleth. What is the most important change that needs to be made to design practice?
I think we need to stop treating indoor air quality as a constraint on energy use. Right, the typical design, you figure out what the ventilation is required to be by the code, and you put in the minimum filter, and then you design to optimize the energy use of the building. At least that's my maybe a cartoonish characterization of the process. I think we need to get to the point where design professionals are educated enough about the impacts of indoor environmental quality, and they're provided with sufficient tools to evaluate it, that we can consider the optimization of IEQ generally and IAQ specifically, and factor that into the value and the life cycle cost analysis of the building. And if we do that, things would change dramatically.
Interesting. Dr. Khankari, same question.
Yes, and I agree with Bill, whatever he said, but we need to understand buildings are for the people. Instead of coming it from top down, it should come bottom up. Design engineers should understand they're designing buildings for the people. And so far what happened is, before pandemic, we got very easy ride. Our consumer of our products, that is the people, they're passive. They don't complain about their indoor air quality because they're ignorant about it. And unless we start this movement that indoor air quality is fundamental human right, just like clean water, clean air is my fundamental human right. And let my consumer demand better indoor quality. If that happens, then everything will fall together. Everything will come together. If I'm designing the building, if I'm designing the hospital, and if I think, what if my son or daughter or my brother is going to work in this building? What else I will do to make this building comfortable and safe for the occupant? So unless we have that paradigm shift in our thinking, I think no matter how many recommendations, how many design guides we write, it will be of no use, because I work with this industry. And if we have this mindset of low cost bidder, think about this, look around us. Who gets the job? Who becomes the contractor? Which firm is selected for designing the building? It's all based on low cost bidder. I think if we change it and think it's not about the low cost, it's about the high performance, I think everything will change.
Interesting. Dr. Taylor, same question.
So I agree with Bill and with Kishore. Create buildings as shelters for people. To do that, I think we need to, again, I sound like a broken record. I think we need to create visibility into the parameters that are important for our health, because the average occupants don't perceive all of the components that are essential. Number one. Number two, I think that materials and material selection need to be brought into the conversation around indoor air quality, and particularly around moisture management. I think porous materials that actually absorb and release water vapor should be considered in the design of mechanical systems. So I think creating visibility around the health components, and to do that, I agree with what Kishore said. Buildings are for people. I agree with what Bill said. Energy is not the only standard. Create visibility and understand the broader picture around moisture management in buildings.
I'm curious, I was at halftime, I was scanning through all the comments, and one was that, when people have a wristwatch or maybe their phone that tells them what their indoor air quality is like around them, we may start to see more change in how we design and manage buildings. And I'm wondering, Dr. Taylor, with the new product you're working with, is that something they will have access to on their phone?
Yes, absolutely. So our company, Building for Health, B for H, does exactly that. We install the TSI AirAssure monitors for continuous monitoring. And from the data that we acquire, we create a health impact rating, and people can visualize that, whether it's on a computer or an iPad, a mobile device, or their phone or a watch. Absolutely.
Interesting. All right, let me go to the next question here. Let's start with Dr. Khankari. What is the biggest knowledge gap revealed by the pandemic? What are we learning we don't know?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are so many things we learned that we don't know. I think the first and fundamental thing is, what are the major contaminants in our indoor spaces? At what rate they are generated, where they're generated, what are the major sources of contaminant? I mean, think about SARS-CoV-2. I mean, this virus, very little is known about it. And their impact on health. So what is happening is, how much it is generated and how much we should control. They are big unknowns. I mean, NIOSH and EPA and all other people have some exposure levels published in their guidelines, but I think there is a need to do more research on this, understand our nature of contaminant, their generation rates, and their acceptable values for safety of the people. The other thing we need to know more about is how air flows into the indoor spaces and what type of diffusers we need. We are just relying on what they call the air mixing diffusers. Do we really need air to be mixed? Is that what the next century demands? So we need to have out of the box thinking. We need to create the paradigm shift. We need to nurture the culture of innovation and out of the box thinking. So I think those are the things in my mind.
You bring up a great point. Over the last 14 years we've been doing this. One of the shows that opened my mind was the Home Chem project that Sloan funded. And I thought they were going to look into things that we talk about all the time. And as it turns out, they were looking at numerous environmental exposures that I never even thought about, and then the other thing that I think is confusing and makes it even more difficult is, how do these interact with each other? You were talking about what we don't know on an individual basis, but then once they get into how do they interact? And I think you bring up a great point. Let's go to the same question, Dr. Bahnfleth.
Oh, sure. I have a lot of candidates here. I think kind of related to what Kishore was saying. I think that quantitative criteria for risk management are a big need. This is one reason we can't seem to come to a clear understanding of what ventilation rates or equivalent ventilation rates are needed. What is acceptable risk and how do you calculate it? And the other thing I'd highlight is air cleaners. There's a lot of potential in air cleaning technology to be low energy and effective, but it's become obvious that we don't know nearly enough about how the basic technologies work, and also there are issues of, say, air distribution related to how they work in a space if we're using something like a portable air cleaner. And there are a lot of other ones too, but those are two that are at the top of my list.
Interesting. And that whole, there's so much confusion on air cleaners too. And then it seems like people want to gravitate toward the ones with the biggest, the best bells and whistles and the most, scientific sounding names, your bipolar ionization and things like that, when a simple air cleaner might do a great job for you.
Well, if the job is to remove particles from the air and you have a technology like a HEPA filter that will remove 99.9+%, do you need something else in most cases? I don't know.
I just want to add to air cleaner subject here. Just buying air cleaner and having a air cleaner in a room, in my opinion, is not enough. Because if you buy a big air cleaner, put it on the floor, and that air cleaner sucks the air from the floor, I call it a vacuum cleaner. It's not an air cleaner. Okay. So where you place that air cleaner, again, let me emphasize this. We need to have clean air in our breathing zone, which is 4 to 6 feet height from the floor. That air cleaner should pull the contaminants from this breathing zone and provide me clean air in the breathing zone. If you're cleaning the ceiling or cleaning the floor, it's not helping my nose. So that thing we need to keep into mind, that just buying air cleaner is not enough.
Great point. All right, Dr. Taylor, do you have a thought on this? What the biggest gap revealed was?
Well, an area that I'd like to bring up is it's not, in my opinion, only indoor air chemistry and how reactants work together as contaminants, but there's a whole field that it's no longer even emerging. It has emerged, which is managing the microbiome of the indoor environment and how that microbiome, in other words, the community of viruses, bacteria, and protozoa that are in buildings and in our bodies. As human beings, we release 37 million microbes per hour into the air. And most of those are good for us. As a matter of fact, we need them to survive. But a component that is definitely missing, in my opinion, from these discussions is managing the building to promote diverse microbial communities that support our health. And that may be hard to think about right now when we're all pitted against a virus, but most microbes are good for us and they're everywhere. So I think that managing the building microbiome with both indoor air quality and surface materials is another key part to maintaining human health.
Great point. And that was starting to gain traction until COVID hit.
I know. Well, nobody wants to think about the good viruses when there's one that's killing so many people.
Great point. All right, John, let's go to the roundup, buddy. All right, the roundup is brought to us by April Air, healthy home at aprilaire.com. All right, I think I want to throw out this last question and just go around the table here and get everybody to comment. What can be done to make better IAQ sustainable? So it's kind of a good way to round things up. Let's go back, let's go to Dr. Khankari first.
Yeah, if we want to make IAQ sustainable, we need to wake up our consumers. We need to educate people what is IAQ. And Joe, you are doing excellent job with this show. I think that's really helping us wake up, understand why IAQ is important. It's unfortunate that people talk about the cost. They talk about the energy efficiency. I mean, in the last decade or so, we have been so much thinking about energy efficiency where we don't want energy efficient building which doesn't perform. And so let's put the people at the center of this equation. Everything will become sustainable.
Well, you're making a lot of my past guests real happy right now. They've been saying that for years, and it's great to hear it from you and the design community too. That's great news. Let's go to Dr. Taylor, then I want to wrap it up with Dr. Bahnfleth.
So again, I agree exactly with what Kishore said. Put people at the center of our buildings, and again, create visibility around what's important for people. So put sensors in all occupied buildings and have people understand how the indoor environment is affecting their health.
And we can do that now pretty inexpensively.
Yep.
Good point. Dr. Bahnfleth, final thoughts on what will make IAQ more sustainable?
Yeah, thanks. And of course, I want to emphasize that making buildings healthier for their occupants is sustainability. But when we talk about sustainability, what we're really saying is how can we have better IAQ in buildings that use less energy? And so, the place you start is source control. The fewer the sources we have to deal with, the less energy it takes to handle them. For ventilation, energy recovery should be used as widely as possible, and it should be efficient. And to Stephanie's point, I think one of the key things is improved demand control, which means sensors that determine where people are and what their exposures are. Because one of the things that we've seen during the pandemic is you can take all the people out of the building and its energy use doesn't change because we're not localizing the delivery of even thermal comfort. But if we develop systems that will give people really high air quality where they're located and turn down or turn off other areas, that would save more energy than anything we could imagine that would improve air quality would do. And the other thing I'd say, improved air distribution. This is all about delivering better air to the breathing zone, as Kishore said, that saves energy. And air cleaners, really important that we learn how to use them safely and effectively, because that's also a big potential energy saver. And combine that with multiple operating modes. We've got a pandemic mode, we've got a wildfire mode, so that we don't have to burn a lot of energy all the time. All of those things will help, and I think we could really contribute to buildings using less energy than they do today.
Let me go to the Z-Man. Cliff, final thoughts or questions for our guests?
I think some final thoughts. I think they've touched on it, but I just want to repeat it. If we go back and think how we got into these problems, it was all about energy. We sealed up all the buildings, and there were incentives in order to do that. And then the problems come afterwards, and we didn't learn from that. And it's the same thing going on now. It's all about energy, and we're not learning from it. And the thing is, we're going to spend the money either way. You're going to spend it on hospitalization. You're going to spend it on drugs. You're going to spend it on those things, or you can invest it in making, as Stephanie says, making the buildings a healthier place. I don't think that we're going to save any money either way. We're probably going to be spending the same thing. It's just where does the money go? And I think we should make energy secondary and concentrate on healthy buildings and healthy occupants.
Excellent. Excellent. Let me go around real quick. I still have 2 minutes. So if you could just give me a short answer, anything you'd like to add, any final thoughts? Let's start with Dr. Taylor.
So just based on what Cliff just said, why do we focus on energy? You can see the energy meter running. You have to take out your checkbook or your Venmo or whatever and pay for it. Yeah. And I think it's that clear impact of energy use, not only on the outdoor environment, but on our pocketbooks, that has given it such a high priority. So again, create that same visibility with sensors on indoor air quality, and we'll know what to do.
Dr. Khankari, final thoughts, anything you'd like to add, anything we missed?
Yes, just keep people in the focus.
Yeah.
Develop all designs, people-centric, occupant-centric, and break the silos. Bring people together, bring different expertise together, and have the holistic approach to IAQ, not just looking from one lens. And if we do that, not only we will have healthy buildings, but we will have very energy efficient buildings too.
And thank you. And thanks for joining us. I look forward to doing a show on the CFD in the not too distant future.
Thank you.
Bill Bahnfleth, final thoughts from you. First, before you do, thank you so much. You talked to me about doing this show, and I thought it was a great idea. And I also want to thank you for your efforts back in 2013-14 as president of ASHRAE and getting ASHRAE more focused on indoor air quality and residential buildings as well. I think those were important things that needed to be done. And I really appreciate you joining us and being a guest on the show.
Yeah, thanks. My pleasure. So I'm a professor. So education. We need designers of buildings, mechanical engineers need some indoor air quality and human factors in their education that isn't there. Building owners and operators need to know why it's important for them to provide good indoor environments to their occupants. And we need education for healthcare professionals and public health and industrial hygienists to understand as clearly as possible the role that buildings play in health. And that will change a lot of things if there's awareness of that. I think you can see that during the pandemic, that we're getting a groundswell of support for better IAQ because so many people have become somewhat educated in the process.
Let's hope that groundswell continues, Bill. Thanks again. Appreciate it. I want to thank this week's guests, the doctors, Dr. Bill Bahnfleth, Stephanie Taylor, Kishore Khankari, Great to have you on. Much appreciated. My co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. John, you got to have faith at the controls. And most importantly, our growing group of loyal listeners and sponsors will be back next Friday at noon with the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
Thank
For
you, Joe.
IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.